It is the 20th of August 1940 in Coyoacán, Mexico. A man in exile reading in his study is attacked from behind by a Stalinist agent, hitting the man hard in the head with an ice axe, penetrating his skull and brain. Despite this terrible blow, the man gets to his feet and struggles with his assailant. Too late, the man's bodyguards come to his aid, beating the assassin off, but a day later, the man succumbs to his injuries. His name? Leon Trotsky, the arch-enemy of Joseph Stalin. The man known to history as Leon Trotsky was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein on the 7th of November 1879, according to the Gregorian calendar, the 26th of October by the Julian calendar, which was in use at the time. He was born in the small village of Yanovka, in what is today central Ukraine, and was at that time part of the Russian Empire. He was not born with the name by which he is popularly known, but was actually called Lev Davidovich Bronstein during his youth. His father was David Leontievich Bronstein, a relatively prosperous Jewish Ukrainian farmer. The family lived in a somewhat isolated part of Ukraine, which was over 20 kilometers from even the nearest post office. His mother was Anna Lvovna. Although the family was Jewish, they were not particularly religious, and Russian and Ukrainian was spoken at home rather than Yiddish, the language typically spoken by Ashkenazi Jews. The world in which Trotsky would grow up was one in upheaval. For centuries, Russia had been underdeveloped politically, culturally and socially by comparison with its neighbors in Central and Western Europe, like Britain and France. This began to change in the 19th century. The population of the Russian Empire doubled between 1850 and 1900. Coal production increased 12-fold during this period, while iron and steel production doubled. Great technological advances such as the introduction of the railways, telephones, and telegrams also brought Russia and Russians into much closer engagement with mainstream European ideas and made the vast country stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean more interconnected. Accordingly, a vast movement began from the mid-19th century onwards to reform Russian society and end the autocracy and inequality which characterized Russian rule under the autocratic emperors or Tsars. In 1861, Russia became the last major European power to abolish serfdom, under which approximately 40% of the Russian population had been effectively under the control of the landholders on whom estates they lived. Further reforms were in store. For instance, censorship of the press was relaxed, allowing for a greater dissemination of political ideas. New political groupings began to emerge in this more permissive political environment. For example, Mikhail Bakunin founded modern collectivist anarchism in Russia in the mid-19th century, which theorized the complete dismantling of centralized state authority in response to the autocratic Tsarist regime. Other groups, such as the Emancipation of Labour Party and the Narodniks, argued for socialism in Russia in the 1870s and 1880s, following the political ideas of the German political theorist Karl Marx. Their ideas began to find increasing support in Russia from 1891 onwards, following a catastrophic famine that year which claimed the lives of approximately 500,000 Russians. Such was the unrest created by the famine that Orlando Figes, the leading English-speaking historian of revolutionary Russia, has argued that the roots of the Russian Revolution of 1917 can ultimately be traced back to 1891 and the death of 500,000 people at that time owing to food shortages. Compounding all of this were the Tsars themselves. While Alexander II, Tsar of Russia between 1855 and 1881, had started out as a liberal reformer, he retreated from this stance over time. His son and heir, Alexander III, was a highly reactionary autocrat. This was the political and social background against which the man who would one day become known as Leon Trotsky grew up. When he was 8 years old, his father sent him to school in Odessa, the major city of the Crimea on the Black Sea in southern Ukraine. Here he was placed in an environment in which a historically multicultural city was becoming increasingly Russified, in line with imperial policy. From early on, his rebellious streak was evident, and while at Odessa, he organized a strike against an unpopular teacher. The events of this time also appear to have been formative in the life of the young Trotsky. Writing towards the end of the 1920s, in an autobiography he wrote entitled My Life, an attempt at an autobiography, Trotsky stated of 1891 that it marked, quote, the official date of the political breaking point in this country. Trotsky was not alone in his thinking, and the struggles engendered by the famine led to the rising popularity of the Russian socialist movement in the 1890s. The disparate socialist groups eventually coalesced in 1898 to form the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a revolutionary socialist party formed to unite Russian socialists in the cause of advancing the lot of Russian industrial workers. The teenage Trotsky was soon involved in these revolutionary political movements, and by 1896 he had relocated to the Black Sea town of Nikolaev, where he joined the Narodniks. A year later, he helped organize the South Russian Workers' Union in the town. Early in 1898, he was imprisoned for the first time owing to political activities. But Lev Bronstein, the future Trotsky, was undeterred. Later in 1898, he joined the newly formed Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Following his arrest at Nikolaev in 1898, Trotsky had been sent to Moscow to face trial for his actions in organizing revolutionary groups in southern Ukraine. After months of inaction in 1900, he was sentenced to 4 years hard labor in Siberia, the thinly populated vast region of eastern Russia, which served as a penal colony for dissenters against the Tsarist regime. His life in exile in the east was tempered somewhat by his marriage to Alexandra Sokolovskaya in the summer of 1899. She had been a member of the political group which Trotsky associated with in Nikolaev, and was a major influence on his decision to shift from being a Narodnik to Marxism or communism. She accompanied him to Siberia. 2 daughters, Zinaida and Nina, were born in the 2 years that followed. Lev Bronstein never served his full 4-year sentence in Siberia. In the summer of 1902, at the urging of his wife, he escaped from the penal colony by hiding in the back of a hay wagon. As he made his way back to Europe, Bronstein reputedly utilized a passport he had obtained bearing the name of one of his jailers from Odessa several years earlier. The surname on the passport was Trotsky, and Bronstein now adopted it as his alias, along with an alternate version of his first name, Leon, as his revolutionary name. Thus did Lev Bronstein become Leon Trotsky, the name the world has known him by ever since. The newly free Trotsky didn't remain in the Russian Empire and instead kept heading west, all the way to London, after escaping from Siberia. Here he made contact with several leading members of the Russian Socialist Democratic Labour Party, who had gone into exile in England after the Tsarist regime of Nicholas II, another poor Tsar who had come to power in 1894, had cracked down on its membership. These exiles included Georgy Plekhanov, a leading editor of the Russian socialist newspaper Iskra, or The Spark, and also viewed as the founder of the social democratic movement in Russia in the 1870s. Trotsky, who is generally regarded as having been a highly accomplished writer and brilliant polemicist, was soon putting his own literary abilities to work with the newspaper. It was also during this period, after his escape from Siberia, that Trotsky met Natalia Sedova. Alexandra had remained behind in Siberia to raise their children, and Trotsky soon married Natalia in 1903. His second marriage resulted in 2 sons, Lev and Sergei, in 1906 and 1908. Trotsky and Natalia would remain married for the rest of his life. In London, Trotsky came into contact with Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin as he has become known, a figure of some controversy within the party. In 1902, Lenin had published a pamphlet entitled "What is to be Done?" This had opened up a wide-ranging and divisive debate within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party over the future of the party. On the one side were purists such as Lenin, who believed that the movement should build its support exclusively around the industrial working class against the Tsarist regime, the landholders and the bourgeois middle class back in Russia, while a separate faction argued that the party should seek the support of the middle class against the Tsarist government and the upper class of Russia, which broadly consisted of the church and the aristocracy. As such, the division came down to one between ideological purists led by Lenin and an opposing faction of more pragmatic and flexible socialists. These divisions within the party came to a head at the Second Congress of the party, held jointly in Brussels and London in August 1903. The conference was held symbolically between 2 cities that Karl Marx had lived and worked in around the time he wrote and published the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels. At this meeting, the party split into 2 opposing factions, known as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Bolsheviks means majority, while Mensheviks means minority, which reflected the results of a vote held on the issue at the party congress. However, this somewhat confusingly did not reflect the actual support the 2 factions enjoyed. In reality, the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, had the support of only a minority of the party membership, while in the years ahead, the Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov, were the more popular and powerful of the 2 factions, which resulted from the split of the Russian Socialist Democratic Labour Party in 1903. Trotsky's initial response to this split in the party was to affiliate himself with the Mensheviks. However, by the autumn of 1904, he had become increasingly disillusioned with the Mensheviks' excessive courting of Russian liberals and the Russian middle class. As a result, he removed himself from affiliation with both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and would spend the next 10+ years as a non-aligned but nevertheless prominent actor within the Russian socialist movement. Unbeknownst to Trotsky at the time, his departure from the Mensheviks occurred just as the cause of political reform in Russia was to undergo the greatest spurs to action that had been seen since the famine of 1891. On the 22nd of January 1905, Father Georgy Gapon led a large demonstration of unarmed protesters through St. Petersburg towards the Winter Palace of Nicholas II to protest against the firing of several workers from the Putilov ironworks in the city over their membership of a workers' assembly. The protest was peaceful, but the large crowds of thousands of people still led to the deployment of thousands of Russian troops. Then, in the late morning, gunfire broke out in numerous locations. Several hours later, when the dust settled, as many as 1,000 unarmed protesters and bystanders had been killed. Bloody Sunday, as the day has become known, inflamed opinion towards the Tsar, Nicholas II, although he had not ordered the attacks. Strikes broke out in most cities and industrial centers throughout the country. This revolution of 1905 was further driven by Russia's loss in the Russo-Japanese War, the first major military defeat for a European nation against an Eastern state in modern times. In response to the escalating unrest caused by these events, Nicholas II re-established the Russian Duma, or parliament, in an attempt to conciliate public opinion, but the country had entered into a phase of increasingly radicalized politics, particularly in the industrialized cities, such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Riga. In the tumult following Bloody Sunday, Trotsky elected to return to Russia from his exile in Western Europe. He traveled home through Kiev in his Ukrainian homeland and then turned northwards to St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire in those days, in the spring of 1905. Once there, he again put his literary abilities to work and began writing for various underground newspapers associated with the Mensheviks. His activities quickly led to him being placed under observation and danger of arrest by the Tsarist regime, and within weeks of returning to St. Petersburg, he had to flee across the nearby border to rural Finland. At the time, this was part of the dominions of the Russian Tsars, but it was ruled separately as the Grand Duchy of Finland, and the police presence was less developed here. Trotsky spent the second half of 1905 moving back and forwards between Finland and St. Petersburg. During this time, he took over the running of the Russian Gazette and increased its readership to some 500,000 Russian readers. It was also during this period that Trotsky became highly influential in the formation of councils or Soviets of non-elected workers in St. Petersburg. These were being established in many Russian industrial cities to represent the workers of the capital's factories. By the autumn of 1905, a St. Petersburg Soviet was in operation and had signaled its opposition to the Tsarist regime. Moreover, Trotsky temporarily served as its chairman. It was this role, as a writer and lead agitator, which led to Trotsky's second period of imprisonment. Late in 1905, government troops arrested many senior members of the St. Petersburg Soviet, including Trotsky. He spent much of 1906 in prison, before finally being convicted of inciting an insurrection in St. Petersburg. Thus, in October 1906, Trotsky found himself yet again sentenced to hard labor in Siberia. However, yet again Trotsky would not serve his sentence. Indeed, on this occasion, he did not even make it to Siberia. While en route to the east in the winter of 1906 or 1907, he yet again escaped from official custody and made his way back west, eventually returning to London in the course of 1907. In London, Trotsky was soon a contributor to the 5th Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. 35 sessions were held in Hackney at the Brotherhood Church there between May and June 1907. These were stormy, with debates ranging from serious policy discussions about how to foment dissent back in Russia to petty squabbles over whether the Congress should be named the Fifth Congress or the Fourth Congress, as the Mensheviks did not recognize an earlier Congress held by the Bolsheviks as being official. Trotsky retained his relatively neutral position within the party and was consequently employed as an intermediary between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Congress is also notable for having been attended by Joseph Jogashvili, better known as Joseph Stalin. Within a few months, Trotsky had relocated to Vienna, and it was while living in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that he would conduct his work for much of the next decade. Here he became involved from 1908 onwards with the Russian Marxist and psychoanalyst Adolf Joffe in the publication of an underground Russian-language paper, Pravda, or Truth, which was smuggled into Russia. 1912 saw efforts to reunite the varying factions with the Russian socialist movement. In January, Lenin held a conference in Prague where the Bolsheviks were joined by a number of Mensheviks. Then in August, Trotsky held a further unification meeting in Vienna, but with little success. This was a relatively extraordinary period of time to live in Vienna. At one point in the first half of 1913, Trotsky lived in the center of the city. Others who either lived in or visited this part of the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time included Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Josip Broz Tito, the future leader of Yugoslavia, and Sigmund Freud, the famed psychoanalyst. There are few similar examples of so many individuals who would shape the 20th century living in such close proximity to one another. Beyond his involvement in the Russian socialist movement, during his exile in Vienna, Trotsky was working on his theoretical views on Marxism. In 1908, he published Results and Prospects, a lengthy essay which built on some theoretical ideas he had conceived and written about in 1905, while in St. Petersburg during the aftermath of Bloody Sunday. These writings outlined Trotsky's views on permanent revolution, his singular contribution to Marxist theory. Trotsky here developed the idea, promulgated by Marx, that sections of the middle-class bourgeoisie would be required to carry out a revolution to implement proper political democracy and a redistribution of land and wealth as a step towards achieving a communist society. Trotsky argued that in Russia, the bourgeoisie could not be relied on to contribute in this way to the revolution, and so the proletariat, or working lower classes, would have to assume the role of carrying out these tasks, a class struggle which would have to be permanent until communism was attained. This theory has gone on to have a substantial impact on Marxist thought well beyond Russia and throughout the 20th century. In combination, these ideas of Trotsky's informed the development of the subfield of Marxism known as Trotskyism, which, at this early stage, was distinctive from Marxism in stressing the need for permanent revolution and support for social revolution in the more advanced capitalist countries through proletarian or working class agitation. Trotsky's view, which was somewhat in opposition to Marx, was that permanent and gradualist social reform would be needed in these countries, whereas Marx had conceived society moving through different stages of development, first capitalism, then socialism, and finally attaining communism. Yet Trotskyism was still a fluid concept, and it would evolve in the years ahead in response to the actual experience of revolution in Russia. While living in Vienna, Trotsky had spent some time in 1912 covering the conflicts which racked the Balkans during this period. His perennial interest in struggles of all kinds, based on class and ethnic divisions, was exhibited during this time in his reportage on the Serbian army's policies of ethnic cleansing against the Albanian people. The Balkans shaped Trotsky's career in exile in more ways than one. It was here in the summer of 1914 that the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, while visiting Sarajevo on the 28th of June, created the spark which eventually ignited into the First World War. By the end of August 1914, Europe was arrayed into two opposing alliances: Britain, France and Russia on one side, and Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire on the other. As a Russian émigré in Vienna, Trotsky was now forced to flee Austria-Hungary and briefly resettled in neutral Switzerland, where Lenin also moved after a period of imprisonment in Austria. In Switzerland, Trotsky began working with the Swiss Socialist Party and wrote a book, The War and the International, in which he opposed the war, in contrast to many prominent socialists throughout Europe who had favored the conflict for varying reasons based on domestic circumstances and also as a conflict which might upend the political situation across the continent and pave the way for the advent of socialist governments. It was this anti-war stance which saw the perennially nomadic Trotsky relocating again in 1916. While in France early in the year, he was arrested on account of his anti-war stance and deported to neutral Spain, from where he was yet again deported to the United States. He was there by early 1917 and lived briefly in the Bronx in New York City. Millions of people from the Russian Empire, many of them Jewish people like Trotsky, had migrated to the Americas in the 19th and early 20th century, and in New York, Trotsky quickly slotted into an established Russophone community. Though he only lived there for a small period of time, he wrote two publications: the Russian socialist newspaper Novy Mir, meaning New World, and the Yiddish daily Der Vorwärts, Forward. It was while Trotsky was in New York that the defining moment for the Russian socialist movement occurred. As with the Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Russia's performance in the First World War, which had swept Europe since 1914, had seriously destabilized the political situation at home in Russia. The Tsar, Nicholas II, had taken personal command of the Russian armies in 1915 and was viewed as personally responsible for a series of major military reverses on the Eastern Front. More critically, heavy borrowing and printing of money to pay for the war effort had seen rapid inflation in Russia, and by 1917, the cost of basic foodstuffs had increased fourfold on what they had been in 1914, pushing the poor to the point of destitution. This, combined with increasing food shortages, saw more radical political movements within the country gaining support. From his exile in Western Europe, Lenin called for the war effort to be turned into a civil war of the proletariat against the Tsarist regime. Within the government, this disaffection was not aided by the Tsar's family. Nicholas II's wife, Alexandra, the Tsarina, was originally German, and her nationality became a focus for criticism and suspicion, as Russia found itself losing the war to Germany. Moreover, the royal family had begun to place an increasing amount of faith in the abilities of Grigory Rasputin, a mystic who had befriended the Tsar's family, and who popular opinion increasingly saw as being the power behind the throne in St. Petersburg. Although Rasputin was assassinated on the 30th of December 1916, His rise had severely tarnished the reputation of the imperial family in the mid-1910s. These social, political, and economic factors coalesced early in 1917 into severe unrest in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was called after 1914. Once it was renamed to make the city sound less German with its Berg suffix. The population of the city had grown from approximately 1 million people in 1890 to over 2 million in 1917, many of whom were poor, overworked and severely disaffected industrial workers. In early February 1917, workers in Petrograd began strikes and demonstrations occurred throughout the city. In particular, strikes began at the Putilov mill, by far the largest employer in the city, with upwards of 20,000 workers. The strike here was sparked by the company reneging on a pay increase, which had been promised to allay the workers' difficulties over the food price increase in the capital, when a lockout from the factory began after the strike. Further demonstrations occurred throughout Petrograd, and by early March, well over 100,000 workers were protesting throughout the capital. The Russian Revolution had begun. Things moved quickly. The Tsar was absent from the capital at the Eastern Front, but commanded the army to intervene to suppress the rioting and demonstrations in the capital. This move backfired, however, as many of the rank-and-file soldiers either refused to comply or simply deserted. The Russian parliament, known as the Duma, now moved to establish a committee to establish law and order, while measures were underway to also establish a Soviet or city council of the industrial workers of Petrograd. Meanwhile, Nicholas II, on his way back to the capital from the Eastern Front, was facing increasing pressure to abdicate as the situation in Petrograd spiraled out of control. Confronted by senior members of the Russian military and urged to do so, he agreed to abdicate on the 15th of March 1917 in favor of his brother Mikhail. However, realizing that he lacked the support to restore order, Mikhail Romanov refused the title of Tsar the following day. Accordingly, on the 16th of March, the Russian Empire of the Tsars effectively came to an end. A provisional government now came to power, headed by the liberal aristocrat Prince Georgy Lvov. While power within Petrograd itself largely lay with the Petrograd Soviet, over the next 8 months, a power struggle would play out between these two contenders for power, the aristocratic Consilia government and the populist Socialist Soviet. When news of the events in Russia reached Trotsky in New York, he immediately began preparing to return to his homeland. He departed the United States on the 27th of March 1917. While crossing the Atlantic Ocean, he was detained for a month at Nova Scotia, in northeastern Canada. Trotsky's commitment to the workers' struggle was evident here. While detained at a British internment camp, he helped organize mass meetings and workers' agitation. Eventually, the British government released him at the end of April, and he reached Russia in mid-May. Finally, back in Petrograd, he became a major player in the struggle which was materializing. Lenin had also returned to the capital from Western Europe in mid-April, facilitated by the Germans, who believed he would serve to destabilize Russia further and thus indirectly aid their own war effort in the process. In Petrograd, he had quickly established the Bolsheviks as one of the foremost groups in the divided politics of Russia in the weeks after the February Revolution. Despite his non-alignment with either the Bolsheviks or Mensheviks in the years gone by, Trotsky drifted towards Lenin's position once he arrived back to Russia itself. Both figures and many of their socialist allies increasingly sought to overthrow the provisional aristocratic regime and establish a radical socialist government. Government crackdowns on some of the more militant groupings in Petrograd had seen Lenin flee over the border to Finland. However, a failed attempt by the military to seize power in Russia and place General Lavar Kornilov in charge of the government in September 1917 saw Lenin return to the capital in October. Upon his return, the Bolshevik Central Committee voted to launch a revolt and seize power, in response not only to the failed military coup d'etat, but also major military reverses on the Eastern Front, which had seen the German army advancing into Russia itself after seizing Russia's possessions throughout most of eastern Poland and Lithuania. Trotsky's role in inciting the revolution, which followed Lenin's return to the capital, cannot be overstated. It was he who authored the resolution which was passed by the Petrograd Soviet on the night of the 22nd of October, one which specifically called for the creation of a, quote, military revolutionary center to facilitate the revolutionary defense of Petrograd and the safety of the people from the attacks being openly prepared by military and civil Kornilovites. The resulting revolt occurred on the night of the 7th of November 1917, according to the Gregorian calendar, which is in use all over the world today, but has become known as the October Revolution, having occurred on the 25th of October, according to the Julian calendar, which was in use in Russia at the time. The Revolutionary Military Committee had appointed Trotsky as its chairman, and he was instrumental in the seizure of power in Petrograd through the October Revolution, by bringing the garrison in the capital over to the Bolsheviks' cause. As a consequence, within 24 hours of the inception of the revolt, many government buildings in the capital had been occupied. Then, on the 9th of November, the Winter Palace, the seat of government itself since the 18th century, fell under the control of Lenin, his party and the Petrograd Soviet. Thus began the long and checkered history of the Soviet state. Within days, the new socialist government began to tighten its control over Russia, with Moscow declaring in favor of the new regime on the 15th of November. Major policy changes were quickly made to begin creating a communist state. All private property was nationalized, as were the Russian banks. Foreign debt was defaulted on. The vast properties of the Russian Orthodox Church were taken into state possession, while factories were placed under the control of workers' Soviets, the members of which were given pay increases and had their working day reduced to 8 hours. In many industrial societies at the time, workers had been expected to work upwards of 12 hours a day, often 6 or 7 days a week, something which had facilitated the emergence of socialist movements in the 19th century. Trotsky's star was in the ascendant in the first weeks of the new Soviet state as a result of his role in the October Revolution and the regard he was held in by members of the Petrograd Soviet. In these days of the revolution, nobody other than Lenin was more powerful within the new regime. His role in the months that followed reflected his status as the second most powerful figure in the government of Soviet Russia. Trotsky was appointed as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs in November 1917, the Soviet equivalent of the Minister for Foreign Affairs. His first task was the war effort, which Russia was losing badly in 1917. Trotsky's first act was to publish the terms of the Triple Entente, the alliance between Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia, which stated the alliance's agreements to redraw Europe's boundaries and redistribute a significant proportion of the lands of the Central Powers amongst themselves in the aftermath of the conflict and as new colonies in Africa and the Middle East. This betrayal of British and French intentions effectively ended the Triple Entente and put Russia in a war on its own against Germany. It also made life difficult for the British and French, as the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, had just brought his country into the war against Germany, but was flagrantly opposed to any expansion of the European colonial and imperial system once the war was over. Beyond these initial moves on the international stage, Trotsky was also soon brought in as a founding member of the Politburo, the political bureau of the Bolsheviks that would govern the new Soviet Union centrally. There were 7 figures on the original Politburo: Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Sokolnikov, and Andrei Bubnov. Most of them would play a role in the power struggles which engulfed the Soviet Union in the 1920s. As part of his position as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Trotsky began peace negotiations with the German government in Berlin to bring Russia's involvement in the First World War to an end. These talks began in December 1917. From the very beginning, the Germans laid out highly punitive terms which involved their annexation of huge tranches of the Russian Empire around modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic Sea region. The government in Petrograd was highly opposed to such terms, but from early 1918, it was facing increasing opposition from within central Russia to the establishment of the Soviet state. With a major civil war brewing at home and the Russian army in no state to undertake a resumption of the war on the Eastern Front, the regime reluctantly agreed to most of Germany's terms in the spring of 1918. Trotsky, who was loath to agree to territorial concessions to a capitalist regime, refrained from casting a vote in the decision to accept the German terms which he had overseen the negotiation of. He had hoped that while the negotiations were underway, the German proletariat would overthrow the Kaiser's government in Berlin, but his optimism in the revolutionary cause proved unfounded on this occasion, or at least premature. Socialist revolts would commence in Germany late in 1918. Under the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on the 3rd of March 1918, and named for the Belarusian town where it was agreed, the infant Soviet state ceded all of Russia's territories in Poland and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to Germany, as well as some territories in the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea region to the Ottoman Empire, Germany's Turkish ally. Russia also recognized the independence of Finland, Ukraine, and Georgia, thus creating new buffer states on its borders. The total losses amounted to over 1 million square miles of Russian territory and 55 million people, as well as a huge proportion of Russia's coal, iron, and steel factories. Lenin was clear that this was an utter humiliation, but the treaty provided the Russian state with time to secure itself at home against its domestic enemies. It was a necessary evil for the revolution to survive. These enemies were multiplying in the spring of 1918 as the Russian Civil War spread throughout the country as far as the Pacific Ocean. By the time peace was established with the Germans and their allies, the Bolsheviks' enemies, a broad coalition of aristocrats, former supporters of the Tsarist regime, Cossacks, army officers, the Orthodox Church, centrists, and even leftists, such as the Mensheviks, who were opposed to the Bolsheviks, had begun organizing themselves into an opposing White Army in opposition to the Soviet Red Army. The Whites acquired significant foreign backing in the shape of aid from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. Less significantly, Other groupings, such as the Black Army and Green Army, arose in regions such as Ukraine to fight for local rights in these areas against the Soviet regime in Petrograd. There was even a Czechoslovak Foreign Legion involved in the Russian Civil War. These were soldiers from Bohemia and Moravia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who had joined the Russians years earlier to fight for Czechoslovak independence from Austro-Hungarian rule. They were in Russia when the revolution occurred and ended up fighting against the Soviets in a campaign far to the east in Siberia in what was one of the stranger episodes in the war. What was clear from all of this to Trotsky and the other Soviet leaders in 1918 was that the great powers and many other vested interests were determined to overthrow and destroy the revolution. Having led the peace negotiations with Germany, Trotsky now took center stage in the Civil War effort and the movement to preserve the Soviet Revolution. In mid-March, just days after the finalization of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, he resigned as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs and was then appointed as People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. Thus, at the height of the Civil War, Trotsky was effectively placed in charge of the Soviet war effort. The initial problems facing him were the small size of the Red Army and the lack of professionalism within it. Consequently, his first act was an enormous recruitment drive. Within 6 months of his taking charge of the Red Army, its numbers had swelled from 300,000 men to 1 million troops. Eventually, this would increase to 3 million men as new fronts opened, particularly in Poland from early 1919 onwards, as Polish separatists undertook the Polish-Soviet War, backed in particular by Britain and France to establish what eventually became the Second Polish Republic. Trotsky's methods as Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs were brutal. In order to instill greater discipline in the rank and file, he devised the notorious blocking units, special units which were placed behind the front line of the Red Army troops, charged specifically with gunning down any of their own soldiers suspected of trying to desert or retreat. Many years later in his autobiography, he laid out his thoughts on this. An army cannot be built without reprisals. Masses of men cannot be led to death unless the army command has the death penalty in its arsenal. So long as those malicious, tailless apes that are so proud of their technical achievements, the animals that we call men, will build armies and wage wars, the command will always be obliged to place the soldiers between the possible death in the front and the inevitable one in the rear. These blocking units remained a common feature of the Red Army for many years and were used extensively again during the Second World War. Beyond this brutal tactic for enforcing discipline on the rank and file in the Red Army, as Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, Trotsky was also a firm proponent of the Red Terror, the ruthless suppression of political dissent within the military establishment and the use of labor camps to provide arms and other supplies for the war effort. As a zealous revolutionary and communist, he believed that such measures were justifiable insofar as they would lead to the destruction of the propertied classes and the initiation of a new global socialist world order. In this respect, the example that he set during the Russian Revolution spoke of an individual who could display a savage streak which was often out of step with his concern for the rights of the downtrodden proletariat. Many of Trotsky's methods would shape the autocracy and violence of the Soviet state in the years and decades ahead. Trotsky's command of the Red Army had also brought him into conflict for the first time with Joseph Stalin, whom, as we have seen, he had met as early as 1905 in London and who was a rising star of the Soviet regime from Georgia. Stalin had established himself as one of Lenin's closest confidants in 1917 and had been given command over elements of the army in 1918, particularly on the southern front in the Caucasus, near his native Georgia. In the autumn of 1918, Trotsky sought to appoint General Pavel Sitin as commander of the Red Army in the south, but Stalin successfully blocked his appointment, the first in a series of increasingly antagonistic clashes between the two figures, which would have serious implications for the Soviet state in the years ahead. Late 1919 saw the tide turn in the Civil War. At that time, various White Army factions, Polish forces, and the military contingents of newly independent states, such as Finland and Estonia, all backed with foreign support from Britain, the United States, and France, who had sent expeditionary forces to the White Sea around Arkhangelsk, threatened Petrograd and Moscow. However, after the breaking of a brief siege of Petrograd in the late autumn, the Red Army finally went on the offensive in the winter of 1919 into early 1920. The end of the Polish-Soviet War in 1920 and the retreat of a British expeditionary force from Central Asia was a turning point, following which rapid advances were made in 1920 and 1921. Eventually, the Civil War was brought to an end in October 1922, when Vladivostok, the last White Army-held city on the Pacific coast of Russia, fell to the Red Army. When the fighting stopped, the Soviet state had lost some of the territory formerly held by the Tsarist Russian Empire, notably in Finland, Poland, and the Baltic region, where the new states of Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had fully established their independence. However, Russia had retained most of its territories, including Belarus, Ukraine, and the Caucasus. The country was devastated, though. On top of the violence and bloodshed, famine had racked the country in 1921 and 1922, difficulties that were compounded by disease pandemics from the Spanish flu, cholera, and typhus, killing upwards of 10 million people when all factors are taken into account. Trotsky's own father died of typhus in 1922. The Russian Revolution had prevailed, though, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had come into being as the first major communist state in world history. With the establishment of peace after 5 years of revolution, civil war, and unrest, the focus of the Soviet state turned to rebuilding and restructuring the economy in line with socialist principles. In 1921, Lenin's government began introducing the new economic policy, a market-orientated economic policy which allowed individuals to own small amounts of private property and included various other elements of a capitalist system. The NEP, as it has become known, was conceived as a temporary retreat from more radical socialist policies, while the Civil War emergency persisted. It was fiercely opposed by Trotsky, who had placed himself by the early 1920s at the far left of the Soviet hierarchy, a government which was headed by Lenin, but which was not a dictatorship like that which emerged in the 1930s under Stalin. Trotsky effectively believed, in line with Marxist and socialist principles, that the state should have complete control over the allocation of all output and that Russia should develop an exemplary command economy. He viewed the NEP as being a betrayal of this concept. Nevertheless, the NEP was adopted despite the objections of Trotsky and other members of the left wing of the Soviet leadership. Indeed, despite claims at the time that it was an emergency measure brought in to deal with the famine and other crises, it lasted well beyond the cessation of the war and was the central basis of the Soviet economy until 1928. Trotsky's opposition to it, as well as his immense intellectual and rhetorical capabilities, saw him emerge as the leader of the left wing of the Soviet regime. Many have gone so far as to suggest that it was he, not Lenin, who was the, quote, genius of the revolution, with his organization abilities and ideological heft winning the Civil War and ushering in the creation of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, as the Civil War was being brought to an end, Lenin's health had begun to deteriorate, opening up serious questions about who would succeed him as head of the Soviet state. He suffered 3 strokes in relatively quick succession between May 1922 and March 1923, finally culminating in partial paralysis and loss of his motor functions, including the ability to speak. When he eventually died on the 21st of January 1924, the Soviet hierarchy, the Politburo, had been preparing for his passing for over 2 years. As Lenin's health had deteriorated from 1921 onwards, it had become apparent that there were 2 major figures who might succeed him as the ostensible head of the Soviet state: Trotsky or Stalin. From the October Revolution of 1917 onwards, Trotsky had effectively been number 2 in the administration, second only to Lenin. His leadership of the Red Army had cemented the wider public perception of Trotsky as the successor designate to Lenin. However, within the Politburo, things had begun to shift. Trotsky was a zealous, often aloof and introverted intellectual, one who was not the most naturally ruthless of politicians. His opponent was the very opposite. As Lenin's health deteriorated, Stalin had obtained the position of Central Committee General Secretary, through which he exercised enormous powers of patronage within the government. Between his appointment as General Secretary in 1922 and Lenin's death in January 1924, Stalin focused on building a coalition within the Politburo to support him and undermine Trotsky's position. He was also responsible for overseeing the formal creation of the USSR in December 1922. Stalin's ascent was particularly assisted by the formation of a triumvirate of himself and 2 of the other most senior members of the Politburo, Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev. This troika would allegedly share much of the power in the post-Lenin world by opposing Trotsky's succession to Lenin. Lenin had his suspicions about Stalin. They were significant enough that in 1923, shortly before his 3rd stroke effectively incapacitated him, he changed his last will and testament to warn the party about Stalin and anoint Trotsky as his successor. Nevertheless, by mid-1923, Stalin's monopolization of power was too far advanced, and he had placed his followers in many important offices, alliances within the higher brass of the Politburo, which held firm in their support for him against Trotsky. At first, Lenin's death in January 1924 seemed to usher in little explicit change in the workings of the Soviet government. The revolutionary government's first leader had been incapacitated for months anyway, and the Politburo seemed to go on governing by collective assent. However, the reality after his death was quite different to those familiar with the internal workings of the Politburo. The troika of Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev now effectively predetermined the decisions that were made by the Politburo. Moreover, Trotsky's diminished position was signified and made public a year after Lenin's death when, on the 6th of January 1925, he was removed from his position as Commissar of Military and Naval Affairs, and even his chairmanship of the Revolutionary Military Council, the position he had occupied in 1917, as arguably the single most decisive character in the inception of the October Revolution. He was allowed to retain his position as a member of the Politburo, but Trotsky increasingly found himself ostracized from any real power within the Soviet regime. 1925 saw him becoming an increasingly isolated and remote figure, estranged from effective power and outside the decision-making circles he had once been so prominent within. When the troika of Stalin, Kamenev and Zinoviev broke up later in the year and Stalin turned against his erstwhile allies, Trotsky is notable only for playing no role in the machinations that followed their downfall. Stalin's split with Kamenev and Zinoviev ushered in the final episodes in the scramble for power in the post-Lenin years. Ultimately, the last acts of Trotsky's career as a revolutionary in his homeland, at the 14th Congress of the Bolshevik Party in Moscow in December 1925, saw him ally with Kamenev and Zinoviev against Stalin and his faction to form what has been termed the new opposition. The speeches they made laid bare that this was now a fight for control of the party, but it was ultimately one in which Stalin was victorious in the months ahead. The death knell of opposition to Stalin's monopolization of power within the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state did not finally come until 1927. In October that year, Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Central Committee. When they then attempted to organize counter-events to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917, the police intervened to break these up. In early November, the pair were expelled from the Communist Party. Eventually, Kamenev and Zinoviev capitulated to Stalin at the 15th Party Congress in December 1927. However, Trotsky refused. As a consequence, in January 1928, he was removed to Kazakhstan east of the Caspian Sea, before being deported to Turkey a year later. Consequently, the lifelong revolutionary yet again found himself exiled from Russia. He would never return. Perhaps Trotsky's fate was better than those who remained. Russia, in the years of Trotsky's last exile in the 1930s, descended into paranoia, terror, and bloodshed, as Stalin tightened his grip on power. Other dissenters in the years ahead, who favored Trotsky's approach to communism, often faced hard penal labor in Siberia. Many more were disappeared or killed by Stalin's regime. The culmination of this reign of terror was the Moscow show trials. When Sergei Kirov, a senior Bolshevik politician, was assassinated on the 1st of December 1934. His murder was used as a pretext for the removal of Stalin's former allies, Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, who had formed the Troika with Stalin in the mid-1920s, and who had helped him to reduce Trotsky's influence within the party. They were arrested, found guilty of involvement in Kirov's murder, and both executed by firing squad on the 25th of August 1936. The Great Purge, or Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 followed, during which Stalin and his secret police wiped out all opposition to the regime in Russia by branding individuals as opponents of the state and Trotskyists. When all was said and done, as many as 1.2 million people died in these years, either through judicial executions or, more commonly, in the horrendous conditions of Stalin's forced labor camps, known to history as the Gulag. As a result of Stalin's reign of terror in the 1930s, Trotsky outlived nearly all those who had remained behind in Russia and opposed Stalin in any fashion, or indeed many people who had simply tried to live in political obscurity in the USSR in the 1930s. After his departure from Russia, he spent 4 years in Turkey, before then living in France for 2 years, between 1933 and 1935. These were often years of limited liberty. In Turkey, for instance, the government of Kemal Atatürk placed Trotsky and his family under close observation and restricted his interactions, wary of having such a noted revolutionary living in their country. That said, it was not an entirely uncomfortable existence. They were given the use of the Yanaros mansion of the island of Buyukuda here in the Sea of Marmara, not far from Istanbul, from where Trotsky wrote while looking out over the sea. One of his major concerns at the time was the rise of fascism across Europe in the wake of the Great Depression, an ideology which in Germany in particular was rabidly antagonistic towards Russian communism. After 2 years in France, Trotsky was moved on by the French authorities and he departed for Norway, but following official pressure there from Russia, he was deported to Mexico, where he arrived early in 1937. It was his last place of exile, and he would eventually die there in 1940. His last years in exile were not spent idly. He remained a prolific writer, writing several books including his History of the Russian Revolution and his autobiography. He also worked with the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States while in Mexico and gained supporters amongst members of the Chinese Communist Party, which was undertaking its long and bitter struggle to gain control of China. Moreover, in 1938, he and his supporters founded the Fourth International, a communist, revolutionary and internationalist alternative to the Stalinist Comintern. It was almost certainly this continued activity and Trotsky's never-ending revolutionary zeal which led to his death, fueled by the paranoia under which all of Russia was suffering in the 1930s. Despite the fact that he had been in exile for many years and that his own position in Russia was unassailable, Stalin had determined in the latter part of the decade to dispense with Trotsky permanently, even in faraway Mexico City. Indeed, Trotsky had lived for many years under the threat of violence. In Turkey, for instance, he had lived near to exile communities of former white counter-revolutionaries from the Russian Civil War, who were themselves in exile in Turkey since the early 1920s. Many were potentially plotting against him, and he had a permanent bodyguard in Turkey. The threat seemed to have diminished when he relocated to the other side of the world, but now on the 24th of May 1940, the fear of violence returned when Trotsky barely survived a raid on his home by Stalinist assassins. It was only a temporary reprieve. 3 months later, another assassin was successful. On the 20th of August 1940, Ramón Mercader, a Stalinist agent, broke into Trotsky's home in Mexico City and drove an ice axe into Trotsky's skull. The blow was poorly delivered, and it was not until the following day that Trotsky finally died in a Mexico City hospital after he had been operated on extensively. He was 60 years of age at the time. Despite being very far from his homeland, some 300,000 people made their way to his funeral service in the days that followed, in a country which had experienced decades of left-wing politics and revolution itself in the first half of the 20th century. He was laid to rest in the grounds of his home in Mexico City, which is the Leon Trotsky House Museum in the city today. Trotsky's death did not bring the spectre of Trotskyism to an end in the manner which Stalin might have hoped for. As the revelations concerning Stalin's megalomania and tyranny back home in the Soviet Union mounted, particularly so in the 1950s after he died, and once his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, denounced his excesses, Trotsky became a revered figure. For many, he emerged as the counterpoint to what Stalin had been. Where the Georgian was viewed as a dictator who simply used communism as a smokescreen to attain absolute power in Russia, his great rival of the 1920s was perceived as an ideological purist, a true communist who was the driving force behind the Russian Revolution and a figure who would have led the USSR along a much better path had he emerged victorious in the power struggle that followed Lenin's death. As a result, a very large number of communist and radical socialist movements in the second half of the 20th century identified themselves specifically as Trotskyite in their ideological approach. This included numerous communist movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, as well as European intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre, while Trotskyism also has had a significant bearing on the Labour Party and various prominent socialist political parties in Britain and France since the 1960s. Consequently, for many, Trotskyism became the acceptable face of communism, a way of viewing what the Soviet Union could have been if the revolution had not been corrupted by Stalin. Though this view is perhaps overly simplistic in overlooking Trotsky's ruthless disregard for human life in the manner in which he led the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. Lev Bronstein, who is known to the world as Leon Trotsky, was one of the most fascinating figures of Russian history, a deeply committed socialist and believer in the cause of communism. He spent his entire adult life fighting for that ideal, twice fleeing exile to the penal colonies of Siberia and spending 15 years as a revolutionary nomad between Russia, London, Vienna, Switzerland, and the United States, before finally returning triumphantly to Russia in 1917 and playing a leading role in the October Revolution. Following the creation of the Soviet state, he was instrumental in the civil wars that followed, essentially becoming the key figure in the early professionalization and development of the Red Army as a formidable revolutionary army. But Trotsky's abilities and intellectual significance extend beyond his practical impact on the government of early Soviet Russia, to his role in shaping the very nature of communism itself in the 20th century, particularly with the theory of permanent revolution, which influenced communist thinkers in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America for decades to come. Yet there is also a paradoxical quality to Trotsky. While at times he was a seemingly humane man, committed to workers' rights and the good of the proletariat, he could also be brutal in defense of the cause of revolution, as his development of the concept of blocking units within the Red Army testifies. Overall, though, his ruthlessness was no match for that of Joseph Stalin in the power struggle which followed Lenin's death in the mid-1920s. Trotsky ultimately ended up the loser in this clash of wills, and his later years were something of an anticlimax, spent yet again in exile from Russia as his rival for power plunged the new Soviet state into years of autocracy, repression, and bloodshed. What do you think of Leon Trotsky? Was he a humane revolutionary under whose influence the history of Soviet Russia could have been spared the worst excesses of Stalin's regime? Or was he a ruthless ideologue who would have made any sacrifice to make communism a reality? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.